Hello, this is Mr. Green's Custom Lures, and I thought I would do a short video today on how I do and how I prepare my epoxy for my lures. So most of my lures that I'm doing tonight are little tiny ones like this guy here. They're already painted and ready to go. So all I have to do is get the clear coat ready, and this video is to show you how exactly I do that. So first, I just have a simple brush from Dollarama. It's nothing expensive, but just to make sure the bristles don't come out when I'm using the epoxy, I'm just going to take some pliers and pinch the end here so that it's just a little tighter. Now, for everything you need a few cups, you need your brush. I would recommend a culinary torch if you have one. If you don't have one, a long barbecue lighter will work well too. These are all the items you should need, as well as, of course, your lures that you're epoxying. Now, I use a scale to do my epoxy because I've already pre-measured this out before many times by eye. So I actually have a written cheat sheet on what exactly my epoxy and my hardener should weigh. I suggest you don't do that. The first time you do that, use these little cups, and they have the measurements on the side, so you can use the little cups to measure out equal amounts of epoxy and hardener. Once you know that you have equal amounts in the cups, then you can go ahead and weigh those cups so you know exactly how much epoxy you need and hardener you need for a specific size of batch. This just makes it easier when you're making multiple batches to weigh out the epoxy quickly if you already know what it's supposed to weigh, because epoxy and hardener does not weigh the same amount. So for the purpose of this video, we're going to be using Lure Coat Epoxy by Lure Build. I got it online from lurebuild.com. Great place, most of you know that. If not, you can ask me for the link and you can get some of this fantastic epoxy too. So I'm going to start out just by getting together what and how much epoxy I need. First, I'm going to fill the epoxy cup, and it's already been pre-weighed for me, so I know exactly how much epoxy I need in this cup. I'm just going to go ahead and pour some epoxy in. Put the lid back on. Use the little squeeze so that we can get an exact amount. Okay, so that's exactly the amount of epoxy I need. Just going to move that to the side, and I'm going to go with the hardener now. And again, I know exactly how much hardener I need because I've already pre-measured these before and weighed them out, so I know what it's supposed to be. You should do this by eye the first time so you know exactly, 5 milliliters and 5 milliliters. If that's what your desired amount is. Okay, so we have our two amounts, epoxy and hardener. I have a small plastic stick here to stir. Our brush is all ready. I'm going to take the hardener because it's a lot thinner, and I'm going to mix it in with the epoxy. And I need this small stick to make sure I get all of the hardener from the sides of the plastic container. Everything has to go in with the epoxy. Try not to let any of it drip anywhere else. Scrape the sides. Get everything. It's somewhat important that you're using equal amounts of epoxy and hardener, so you can't lose it or make mistakes. Put all our hardener and epoxy together in one. Now I like to leave it flat, and then I'm supposed to stir for 4 minutes. Now, as soon as you start stirring it up, it's going to go foggy and it's going to get some air bubbles. Don't worry about air bubbles and fogginess. That's supposed to happen. As you mix up your epoxy, it will settle. So most of the air bubbles will settle in one place together and the epoxy will go clear. So I'm just going to go ahead and stir this for 4 minutes and then we'll come back and show you what our epoxy looks like. Okay, I stirred up our epoxy for 4 minutes and now you can see it's mixed well. It's cleared out, but it has a lot of bubbles. Don't worry about the bubbles. We're just going to set the epoxy down for a couple minutes and all the bubbles, or majority of the bubbles, should collect at the surface and all toward the center of the cup. Don't worry if you still have some bubbles inside the epoxy as you're brushing it on, because our little torch will be very handy for getting rid of those. And we'll show you exactly how we do that in a moment once we get the epoxy on the actual baits. Okay, after we let our epoxy sit for a few minutes, I don't know how well you can see, but a lot of the bigger air bubbles have popped. You can see there's a lot of small air bubbles in the epoxy. I'm going to place it back down on my tray and I'm just going to hit it once really quick with the torch. And just like that, majority of those bubbles are gone. Now our epoxy is actually ready and we can start applying it to our baits. Now the great thing about this lure coat epoxy is you have a few options. You can brush it on and put it on a turner and you'll have fantastic results. Or you can do what I do, and that's brush it on in very thin coats. And when you brush it on in very thin coats, this gives you the advantage you can actually hang the bait to dry. You don't need to put it on a turner with this lure coat epoxy as long as you're using small amounts. So we won't start with the little tiny baits because it might be hard for you to see. I'm going to epoxy a different bait to start. We're going to epoxy this bait here. It's a nice little X-wrap. So all I do is dip the brush in the epoxy. You don't need too much. And just brush it on. I usually start from the head and work my way toward the tail. And again, don't go too heavy if you're going to hang them. If they're going on a turner, you can add more epoxy. It doesn't matter. On the turner, the epoxy will move around as it dries, so it won't leave any problem areas. So I'm just going to brush this on very thin, just like this, just until everything is shiny. Don't worry as you're brushing it on too much if you get some air bubbles on the bait. That's okay. I'll show you exactly what we're going to do in a moment to remove those air bubbles. Just brush it on nice and even. Make sure you cover everything up. Always get the end too, just in case. And we're going to get the bottom too. If you find the brushes that you bought seem to leave a lot of air bubbles, then try and get some different brushes. I've tried about 3 different brushes so far, and these ones seem to be the best. Okay, so I don't know if you can see, I got one nice thin coat everywhere, but there's a few air bubbles on there. So all I'm going to do is from a distance, hold the bait, and you lightly go over it with the torch. This will pop all the air bubbles. But make sure you keep the bait moving or the torch moving, or you could actually melt your bait. But once you've done this, it's ready to hang. There's no more air bubbles on it. You can either place this on the turner or you can hang it up to dry. This one I'm going to hang to dry, and then I'm going to continue with the rest of this epoxy. Thanks for watching. This is Mr. Green's Custom Lures. I hope you enjoyed my video on how to do epoxy, and have a great night.